Hello, climbers, and welcome to Season 4 of Climbing Mount CMMC. Hello, climbers, and welcome back to another episode of Climbing Mount CMMC, the podcast. We are talking about Customer Responsibility Matrices. This is a part of our Pro series, so we're going to get a little bit more in depth into what a CRM is and how you use it, and also just some things that we've learned along the way. But before we really dive into this, if you are not aware of what a Customer Responsibility Matrix is when it comes to CMMC and how it may affect you and your organization, well, if you're using an external service provider, you are going to need, or they are going to have to bring to the table, a Customer Responsibility Matrix. So right off the bat, if you don't know if your MSP or external service provider that you're using is ready for CMMC, here's how you can tell. Ask them for their CRM, and if they don't have one, they're definitely not ready for you. So this is a requirement for an ESP if they are a part of your system. When you are bringing your SSP and your documentation to a CMMC level 2 assessment, you are going to have the external service provider bring their Customer Responsibility Matrix. So if they do not have that, you're probably not going to get past phase 1. I don't know how to tell you. I don't know how to tell you that. So let's get that right off the bat. And we did not come up with this. This is in the CAP, the CMMC assessment process. This is in the 32 CFR final rule that was released December of 2024. And this is covered in both of those documents, which are very important documents. So make sure to check them out. We'll have them in the link in the description, as well as if you're watching this, we'll have some images of where we pulled this information on the screen. But let's talk about just first what a CRM is, right? Bobby, I know you have looked at our CRM many of times. So would you care to explain to the people what this is for?
Yeah, so it's basically if another organization other than the company getting assessed is going to be involved in the assessment, they just want to see who's responsible for what. And that's where the whole matrix concept comes in. So it's not like Neo and Morpheus from the movie. It's really about, although sometimes it may feel that way, it's really about you as maybe a managed service provider, like what parts are you as far as in how it's being implemented and what parts are the client. An example might be who's going to handle the onboarding process and what parts of it.
Right.
The MSP obviously isn't going to do the hiring and the firing of people, but they'll be involved in it. So they just want to get a better idea of how it's going to be defined. And it also, I think, is reasonable to assume the matrix should be somehow tied to your agreement in some way about defining the MSPs doing these things, and their agreement says we do these things, and that's defined in our matrix or somehow around that. But the matrices, I think, is really intended to be just a table of contents for the auditors to point them to who they turn to say, okay, in the matrix, it says you're responsible for this. Can you speak to that?
Yes.
And they have to be prepared. And it also should be very helpful in your assessment prep for you to, and this is another pro tip move, is like when you're working with clients, if you're an MSP helping them get ready, the ones that are marked for their responsibility, you should help prepare them in understanding what their part is going to be involved in the assessment when the auditor goes to turn. And there are various different ways that something might be referred to as a client's responsibility, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yes.
But, in a very high-level, brief concept, it's either the MSP is doing it themselves, the client's doing it themselves, somehow we're working on it together or collaboratively. But then also, just because it's the client's responsibility, they may be responsible for saying, yes, this looks good, but it still may be kicked to the MSP to actually do it. So even in the assessment, it still might be that the MSP still talks about it. An example of that might be the definitions of what you're going to do audit-wise. You think the client's going to have a good idea of all of the things that you would want to scrape in Sentinel? No, probably not. They just want to say, okay, well, we understand those audits need to happen. We might have a cadence of review. We authorize you to do it. Go with our blessing.
Right.
And that might be the extent of their part of that control. They've now empowered you to go do it, and then you go do the technical piece.
Okay. You've said a lot of nuggets of wisdom
Yeah, that was a lot.
in those 2 minutes that you said that whole thing. So I'm gonna break down for the people listening all the things that you said because I think they're very, very important, each one of them. The first one that you talked about is the agreement, the ESP and the OSA's agreement that they have should connect and speak
Right.
to the CRM. So I want to go a little bit more in depth about this because I do think many people miss this,
Hmm.
and I think this is critical when you are an MSP that is stepping into the CMMC ecosystem because nobody wants to get sued.
Right.
Like who wants to get sued if you fail an assessment and it's on you? You know, like you don't want your client coming to you pissed because you didn't do something that you said you were going to do or that you didn't say you were going to do but they thought you were going to do it, right? And so there's multiple ways where this could blow up that you don't want to happen as an MSP. So this agreement is, in my opinion, so important for MSPs to have that talks to their customer responsibility matrix and what they are doing and what they're promising and what
Right.
they're not promising, right? And so if you are wondering if we're saying this as our opinion or not, we're not saying this as our opinion. This is also spoken to in the CMMC assessment process. They say
Right.
that if you have an external service provider, they want to see your CRM, the customer responsibility matrix, and they want to see the agreement
Right.
that speaks to. So, and I think you're totally correct, Bobby, is the reason that they want to see both of those is because it does tie together in that way of what you are agreeing to and not agreeing to do as the external service provider and who's
Hmm.
on the hook, right?
I so I would do a pop quiz here. Let's throw it out to the group at large. But what I would say is if you were an auditor and you came in and you looked at the agreement that the MSP had the client sign and they're going through the audit and you saw no reference to the responsibility about the relationship, it's just, hey, we're going to provide some basic services, but it doesn't in that agreement define that they're on the hook or responsible for any of the CMMC controls, and but yet they still have a CRM. Would you pass them or fail them? Would you
Mm-hmm.
would you on that because the agreement doesn't specifically show that there is agreement that requires them contractually to help and fulfill those requirements? Would you not let them out of phase one? Would you give them a false start? I don't know if I would have the guts to do that as an
Wow.
auditor. I don't know. That's a good question. I would have to think about it. I kind of thought of it and I said, you know what? Let's throw this out to the masses and see what people say because I'm really
Yeah.
curious.
Well, I mean, it does say that it wants to, in the cap, it says that it wants you to speak to, what you are and not doing, are and are not doing,
Right.
in the agreement. So I would be very curious on what an auditor or an assessor would let pass in that regard and what they
Mm-hmm.
would not let. So,
Yeah, if they had the CRM, which is what we're talking about today, I think a case could be made that you could move forward. But if they didn't really have a tangible CRM that was broken down to the assessment level, for example, maybe they just did it by control, and we
mhm.
said it's partial, and you're like, what's partial? Boy, you're really leaning on the auditor to kind of just give you a lot of grace here because
Yeah,
you're not breaking down the assessment objectives about who's responsible for what. You're speaking about
yeah,
things very, very in general. Your agreement doesn't talk about it, man. You are really moving on thin ice there
yeah.
at
You're
that
hoping
point.
for a Jesus-like auditor giving you grace in that way, and I would not cross my fingers, on that one. That's very scary. Speaking of auditors or assessors, another thing that you brought up when you were talking first about what a CRM is it should be guidance for the assessors, right? And so let's speak more on what you mean by that. So when an assessor is looking at the CRM, you're kind of saying here that it's going to point them in the direction of who to talk to in the assessment, right?
Mhm.
Can you
Mhm.
give some guidance to people on specifically how that works and what that would look like?
Yeah, and definitely in phase one of the things that the auditors want to know is the scope, how you're doing the scope, and who's responsible for those different components and pieces. Also, a lot of times in phase one, they're going to give you a list of who they're going to interview in phase 2. So they want to see the list of who's going to be talked to and what they're going to have the conversations. And that phase 1 part helps them really get a good idea of what that's going to be and who that's going to be. But the matrix also helps provide definition for the auditor to kind of get a good idea who should authoritatively speak about those specific controls. If you have your CRM broken down by just the 110 controls versus the 320 assessment objectives, what you're doing is talking about a car versus a specific make and model and what you're speaking into to that. And the auditors want to see down to the make and mark and model and all that stuff. They don't want to talk in generalities about those kinds of things because that's what they're doing. They're going into each assessment objective and they're marking it met and not met, which will ultimately mark the control met. But they've got to get down to that level. And if your matrix doesn't break those down, it gets very difficult for them to talk about, because what's going to end up happening is most controls are going to be partially met by, they're going to be shared. Most of them will be shared. So almost every control, they're going to be like, all right, whose job's who? They're not going to know for the most part.
Okay, so you're going into something that I love. I want to go into detail about this, is the different parts of a CRM, right? And what they want to see. So right off the bat, we can go ahead and say you should not only be listing the CMMC, NIST 800-171 controls, you should be listing the assessment objective level. And the reason is because it gets that specific. That's how specific it gets when you're talking about working with an external service provider. Let's put up on the screen and let's talk about here 3.1.1. You could read one page into the controls and already start to see the movement and the change and shift between what a OSA is going to do in that control and assessment objectives and what an MSP is going to do. Because you've got the identify pieces. You notice A, B, and C are all identify. Identify this, identify this, identify this. The MSP does not hire people for you. They do not identify who your employees are because they are not part of your company. They are external. And so you, as an organization, has to identify and has to do those things. So right off the bat, boom, you as an organization seeking assessment is going to do A, B, and C of 3.1.1. And then after A, B, and C comes D, E, and F, which are actually doing and implementing what you need to be done, which is the person, the device, and the access that they get, right? And so already right off the bat, one, if you're a person listening to this that is a MSP that is promising 100% of coverage of the controls, you're lying, because I just spoke to that right off the bat. So here we go. It is, and that is why it's so important that just like what Bobby was saying, a customer responsibility matrix goes to that assessment objective level, because while you are doing this as an external service provider, you are going to see where it starts to become like a joint responsibility, wholly yours, or maybe just the organization seeking assessment, right? And you're going to start to see those broken out. Bobby, do you want to speak to a little bit more, even when making this, because you got it perfect the first time around, right? You did it all and you filled it out and you said who was responsible and it was perfect and there was nothing wrong and you went with version 1 of your customer responsibility.
I don't think I'll ever be happy with my CRM. And it's not that CRMs, just like SSP in general, there's an art, there's a design to it.
Yeah.
It's not ones and zeros, binary, pure, unadulterated fact. There's a lot of perspective and thought and opinion and belief that all goes into those things. And so with the CRM, there's no difference. There's plenty of controls that we looked at from one perspective and we're like, okay, this is going to be shared. But then you're like, but if I look at it from this perspective, it would be ours. But if I looked at it from this perspective, it would be the client.
Yeah.
And so, you kind of have to have your CRM defined, but it is reasonable to assume that some of them may change based on the type of engagement as an MSP you're going to have for the client. I can't imagine that not being the case.
No.
Unless you just only accept specific cookie cutter type situations. And then, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But I mean, that's not really life in general. There's going to be lots of clients that have lots of flavors. They're going to have physical media, like paper, but they may not use removable storage. They may have virtual machines, but they might have physical machines. They might have BYOD. They may have devices that are connected to the system but are out of scope. They might have systems that are in scope but have access to CUI. Okay, how are you going to handle that? There's all of these different scenarios that can change sort of the responsibility of how things are going to go, because if it's in such a way that the MSP has full control over these pieces, then there's a lot better chances for them to fully inherit or push some of those inheritance to, like Microsoft, for example. So the physical facility is a perfect example of that. If you keep a completely cloud environment, and your MSP can then kind of say, well, look, you're using this cloud solution that is yours, that we built for you, and you get to inherit that from Microsoft. So you don't have to worry about the physical piece. That's all going to go through Microsoft's inheritance. And the MSP can kind of help move the auditor through that process and understanding it. Now you could punt that to the MSP and say, no, they'll have those discussions. I mean, that's really up to you how you want to do it. But that's where that responsibility matrix comes into play, is you want to start thinking about who's going to talk about it and who's going to own it. And it also, the example of Microsoft can start to point out that there might be situations where there's another party involved besides the managed service provider that's actually owning that.
Yeah.
Right? So
So there
Microsoft
could be
being the case for
multiple
the physical.
ESPs involved. I definitely think that's more of a possibility. I mean,
Yeah.
just like when you're saying, like, because there's CSPs that are under the category. So there are external service providers that are MSPs. So MSPs are under that category, but so are CSPs, cloud service providers, and so just like what Bobby was saying, you've got Microsoft, you've got Google, you've got these things that you might be using for your environment, that then you have to get their CRMs that they should give you, and you can inherit things from that, right? And so this is where exactly what you're saying of, like, it's not just an MSP, like, it's external service provider. So there are going to be multiple different scenarios where that occurs. So yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so get down to the AO level, get down to the assessment objective level. Let's talk about responsibility and how you label that in a customer responsibility matrix, okay? So
Do you want to read the cap out of 217? I think that does a good job.
I was just about to say, would you read that?
Right, 217, in there, you'll see it says the assessment team shall evaluate that the customer responsibility matrix, CRM in parentheses, of the ESP, which would be like us, is up to date, includes all relevant parties with security responsibilities, and addresses all in-scope CMMC security requirements performed wholly, partially, jointly by the ESP. So they want to know how it addresses all the in-scope CMMC security requirements.
Yep. Straight from the cap. So straight from what the auditors and assessors should be looking at when they're assessing you, right? So let's talk about this. Wholly, partially, or jointly. So wholly could be done by the external service provider completely, right? And are there a lot of those? It could be, depending on what type of MSP you are, and depending on what type of services you do have. For if you're bringing in somebody like a cloud service provider, it's like Microsoft, they're not going to have a lot of holies in this. I don't think they're going to have any. But if you're bringing in somebody that's an MSP, that's another story. There are definitely a lot of things that they're going to do and be fully responsible for. So you're going to want to identify those. And then you're also going to want to identify, this is something that we kind of talked about before because I was confused on what this meant. What's the difference between partial and joint for, and so do you want to explain what the difference would be of something that is partially, a responsibility versus jointly the responsibility of the ESP?
Yeah, so this is one of those types of things that I believe kind of down low refers to inheritance.
On the DL.
Right, on the down low. What do I mean by that? So let's say that I'm an MSP and I have not got my level 2 certification. So what they're wanting to see is, what is the responsibility between me and the company I'm working for that's getting assessed, right? So we're supporting a company and they're going to get assessed. So if it is jointly, that means, like, for example, awareness training, right? The people in that container are going to have awareness training, but the MSP who's coming in to support them is equally going to have awareness training as well. But guess what? If you had your level 2, you get a pass, because the fact is you already did that.
Yeah.
Your users should have been in scope of your audit.
That should have already been assessed in your assessment.
Right. And they go through and they do there. Now, this goes back to a big challenge with MSPs, is they have to properly scope themselves so that the users were in scope of the audit. So they are now being, it would be disingenuous, I think fraudulent, a bold-faced lie if you had people that were not and are not in scope of your assessed container, right? In other words, you have people, maybe you have 2 different companies or pieces, and they're doing support and they were not in your audit.
Right.
Which is entirely possible. The MSP could be doing those types of shady things, which I just hate to think that someone out there is doing that. But this is where the auditors typically want to see at least the scope or design that the MSP, that when they had their audit, they just want to get the general idea of understanding when they're supporting their client, are they using the scope that was assessed? If they're going to try to leverage that inheritance piece, are they doing it the right way? To me, I feel like that would be a very reasonable approach for the auditor to ask the MSP to say, hey, what kind of scope did you guys have? And are you supporting the client out of that scope? And if they're like, I don't understand what you mean, well, that would be a big red flag as an auditor. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know what I mean when I ask that question? Like, that's your freaking job.
Yeah, you should know what that means.
You should know what that means. So that's what I think when they say joint is that like, the MSP should absolutely do incident response for themselves.
They have to do the same amount of those,
and they have to be doing it just like them. So that's where jointly you both should be doing those things.
Yeah.
If you don't have your level 2, then guess what? You have to prove that you're doing that IR in its totality with you and your team and them. You have to connect the dots between both. If you don't, if you're just like, well, they do it, and you're like, well, but what do you do? Well, we do it. Like, what evidence do you have that you've done it? Like, how did they connect? And you're like, well, we, like, no, not met. Like, that at that point, it's joint. The MSP is on the hook if you don't have that. So that's what I believe that responsibility, what they're trying to get.
So what, in that case, this is me just learning. In that case, like, if you put your assessor hat on and you're looking for that jointly, requirement, and they are not CMMC level 2 certified, and that you want to see the evidence of how they do background checks, are you going to want to see their system security plan?
There would
like
be, they would have to prove it.
Providers?
Yeah. They'd have to prove it, sure. Yeah,
Wow.
that has to, because the auditor, like, you're inside the system, you're supporting it, you're responsible for those controls, you absolutely have to validate how you're doing those types of things. And if you don't have some means of proving it, like a level 2.
See, and that's where you start to see.
That's where
you start to see that the level 2, like getting a CMMC level 2 certification for, as an MSP can greatly benefit your clients and give them security and yourself when going into assessment with them. So, okay, and then partial. So, because they said wholly, partially, and jointly. So we talked about jointly, but partially.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this, and this goes back to theory. We're going to talk theory here.
Oh no.
So there are 2 types of services I believe an MSP provides. There's services provided and infrastructure provided. What's the difference between the 2? So services provided would be like, hey, I stand up your Sentinel and I monitor it. Okay, that's my team. That's my responsibility. We go to do it. We manage it. It's still your Sentinel. I didn't automatically clone mine and then they're linked together so that when I change it here, it's doing there. There are ways to do some things with Sentinel to where you can do, but that's not the scope of what we're talking about. Let's talk theory of that, right? So let's say that that's happening. Well, that's just a service you're providing. And I could do the service really well with one client and I could suck at it for another. So the auditor is going to want to see every client that you've got. How are you providing that service? Is it accurate? Is it, if you're using the same C3PO, they're going to start like, are you guys kind of doing the same way? And, the C3PO is going to be able to more accurately not give you a pass, but they'll be able to say, okay, they don't have to get up to speed with how you're doing it. They can very quickly know how you're operating because you've been doing it the same way for all the other clients.
Yeah, unless
so that makes sense
amnesia,
to them.
But
Right. They don't immediately go, who are you again? You're like, dude, we just talked last week with this other client, which I can't tell you that person's name, but you know who they were because you were sitting on the other side with that person. Now, infrastructure provided would be, for example, let's say that you're hosting the patching solution for that client or the vulnerability piece. And that part was fully assessed in your audit. Now you're talking. Now you've got something that has been completely assessed, and they're leveraging.
Yeah.
At that point, I think it's an auditor's discretion if they feel like they want to allow that to be a pass from the MSP's audit. There's no clarity about exactly how that goes. They just kind of punt that to the auditors to kind of decide on how they want to handle that. In my opinion, I think if you clearly define that infrastructure, you show that it was in your audit, you can prove that it's in your audit, that would be discussed in phase one. Any of those types of controls then would be able to be inherited. There's not a ton, but this starts pushing a lot more of the self-hosting to the MSP to start doing. And then immediately everybody starts screaming, oh, that must mean that they're like Microsoft, they're a cloud service provider. And you're like, no, that does not mean that they're a CSP. And the reason why it's not is you can't whip your credit card out and just go ahead and get those services. It is a pure relationship.
You still have an agreement there.
Yeah. It is not like you're not doing it as some massive scale rollout. This is a relationship between you and the client. So just because you're hosting services and providing them does not immediately brand you a cloud service provider.
Yeah. So let's talk about speaking to the assessment objective or the responsibility in the customer responsibility matrix. So, we've identified that in your CRM, you should have every control from this 800, 171, 110 of them, and you should break down the 320 assessment objectives. So you break each of those down in your CRM, and then you speak to if you're wholly, partially, or jointly responsible, or, not at all. Maybe it's the full client responsibility of that control, right? So after you break those down, Bobby, is that the end of the road, or are we going to speak to what or how they are responsible, or you are responsible, or what?
Yeah, to me, I feel like that's the bare minimum. You can do the checkbox method, go down to the assessment objective and say, you could have 3 columns, for example, like you said. You could have client, ESP or MSP, whatever you want to call that column, and you could say shared. So it's like either we're working on it together, it's one or the other. You could do that and just do the little battleship method and just check each one off, and that's fine. And that gives the auditor what they need to know at the very basic level. But I don't agree with that. I feel like you should provide some additional insight about what those responsibilities are, because sometimes even though the client may not be involved to specifically speak about it, you still may want to talk about the requirements that you would want to make sure that they understand they're responsible for. For example, maybe you have enforced policies and they're responsible for adhering to those policies enforcements that you have, and you want to state that in your matrix. Is it specific to the audit? No, but because your matrix is showing the responsibilities, you may want to include that so you can really kind of double down in your explanation to the client about what they're on the hook for, because everything's all great until people have a disagreement. And then you're like, well, I disagree with that, and you're like, well, it's in the matrix and this is how we show it. And then you're like, okay, well, what do you say about that?
Yeah, that's what we agreed to.
Like that, yeah. And then even better, if you call it in your contract, you're like, but you literally signed on the dotted line saying that that's how that's going to go.
Yes. And that's exactly what I was about to say is, even if you take the assessment out of the picture and you're just talking about your relationship with your client as an MSP, why would you not want to just define that a little bit more clearly? I am not saying give the exact directions on where to go to find this thing. I'm not saying that, because that's what a system security plan is for, right? But when you're speaking to your agreement and adding your agreement into this and, talking to your customer responsibility matrix, you need to lay out certain things on how exactly you're responsible or what exactly the client is responsible for. Just like exactly what you're saying, Bobby, is we gave the client these papers and we gave them this policy to follow for this. If they don't, that is on them.
Right.
We have provided them, the walkway. If they choose to walk off of it, we can only do so much. And that's why I completely agree with you that it needs to speak to that. And this is why I think if you're an OSA listening to this, okay, or even an assessor or whatnot, if you ask for a CRM from an MSP or an external service provider, and they just have the checkbox method, in my opinion, I don't feel like they have their stuff together. Because a good MSP is going to want to connect those dots, and they're going to want to speak to that because they do this for a living and they're in the space and they know how to do it, and they have to do it with multiple different clients, which is more of an opportunity for the client to get mad or disagree with something. And you want to make sure that you cover your bases and that the client feels comfortable in what they're covering and what you're covering, not even including an assessment involved, just in general.
Yeah, I would say there would be only one exception to that rule, and I've not seen it, where people put more of that conversation that would be traditionally in the matrix in their actual agreement. And so they they just play the battleship method in the matrix, and those definitions.
What a long agreement.
But see, my point is they're covering generalities of those types of things and statements and responsibilities. There's no way they're going to cover it to the assessment objective, and that's why I like the matrix method. You pointed out, because there's no way you're going to write your agreement based on all the assessment objectives.
Yeah.
But I've seen people say, well, no, I have that covered in my agreement. I have that covered in my agreement. I'm like, okay, I see you, but again, you're not going to cover all 320 in your agreement. But if you have it in your matrix and your agreement calls it, then you'll have both.
Okay, but here's where I see that being a problem. And you can tell me if I'm off base with this, but let's say that you are an MSP working with an organization that has like a IT person that is doing something. Well, but you already wrote in your agreement that they signed that you do that thing. And so now you have to change your agreement? Whereas if you spoke to what you were doing more clearly in the CRM, which you have to have a CRM that speaks to each of your clients, you could kind of write out that, oh, this is where IT person Bob does that in the CRM rather than us. So I couldn't imagine wanting to change your agreement instead of changing the CRM.
I perfectly agree. Yeah, I agree with you. And I would also point this out too. You want to think of the matrix, the customer responsibility matrix, as is really directed towards the client and possibly their attorney, if you will, about how that separation of duty. But the auditor is going to use it to see who should speak potentially authoritatively around that topic. The SSP is going to speak specifically about how that assessment objective is done. So both of them talk to the same assessment objective. It's just a different perspective of how they do it. But the matrix is not intended to speak about how that control is specifically met. It's supposed to just speak to who's responsible for meeting it.
Yep.
And that's where I've seen people go really in a lot of depth, and you're like, so now your matrix is competing with your system security plan.
Yeah.
I think that's dangerous, because then you have to always make sure that they're in alignment, because if you change something to SOP and then maybe you forget it in your matrix.
So much room for error, I feel like.
Well, I mean, that's just the nature of CMMC, the way they have so many documents. I mean, there's just no way you're going to get everything perfectly right when you have literally hundreds of thousands of lines, millions of words written, hundreds of pages. I'm like, our SSP alone's over 200. I think our administrative document's like 50. I mean, it's not that I'm bragging. I wish they were considerably smaller, but when you go to talk about specific controls and you have 320 of them, there's no way it's going to be like tiny, unless you just refer to every policy and you have no real statements whatsoever of matter and substance in your system security plan.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into CRMs in the Pro series that we're doing. We're excited to continue this and get a little bit more in depth about some theory and just our ideas and how we did things. I think the one thing I want to leave you guys with is, I'll say one thing to OSAs and one thing to MSPs. OSAs, if you're working with an MSP and, you have a relationship with them and they are your MSP, you should be able to very clearly ask for the CRM before you go into your assessment to make sure that they know what they're talking about. Please make sure to review that. I'm begging you. And the second thing is, if you are an MSP and you have a client that is going for CMMC level 2 and they need to get a certification, have that CRM and have your agreement speaking to it. If you do not, you are not bringing the two things to the table that you really have to bring for them to pass phase 1 of an assessment. Okay? So please, please, please make sure to do that. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, pass your clients over to us. I'm just kidding. But I'm not. But anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, if you want to see more about the different Pro Series episodes and you want to see a specific topic, please make sure to let us know and comment. We would really, really love to hear that feedback from you guys. So please let us know. Also, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to be notified anytime we upload new content on there as well. We have some webinars that we post on there too, so make sure to check that out. And until next time, guys, keep on climbing. See ya. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube to stay up to date on the latest CMMC news. We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode and listen out for the next one. But until then, keep on climbing.